Paul spent a career at what is now known as the Productivity Commission in Australia, that wonderful institution which began with the name of the Tariff Board, whose purpose was to enlist protection for all and sundry, providing they showed that they paid their workers well. And by many years of careful and interesting manipulation, this has become a body centrally concerned with microeconomic reform in the Australian economy and with promoting such reform. And Paul has played a significant role in his time there, both in relation to internal reforms and reforms in relation to trade policy. He and I have been talking ever since the Brexit referendum about the way in which Australian experience on trade policy might well act as a useful input into discussions in Britain about what to do with Brexit. And we're in the process of putting together a meeting either late this year or early next year about the use of Australian experience in thinking about what to do in Brexit. And it seemed a good idea for Paul to first of all present to us here this paper, which is about the Australian lessons, I think it's fair to say, in relation to how to engage in international discussions of trade reform. And you could regard this as an overture to work which Paul is going to be doing with me and with others about Brexit questions. So I think it's helpful to listen to this paper with Brexit written all over your field of view, although the paper is very explicitly not about Brexit at all. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, David.
As you start, I'm going to grab myself a sandwich. And please, all the rest of you, do the same.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, for that kind introduction. And thank you for coming along today for this presentation. Now, just a little bit of background about how the presentation came to be, and that'll make more sense of some of the results and the ideas that I present throughout. In Australia, there's been a growing concern about the number of preferential trade agreements that have been growing up and the noodle bowl of regulations that are necessary to enforce those preferences. And that's led to the question is, well, what strategies might you follow to make the trading system less complicated? Now, it's also against a background of... No, I've just got to make...
Sorry, it's just...
Oh, sorry, I go here, do I?
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right, no. Against a background of international trends which are of some concern, and it's been observed in a general way that the growth of trade post the global financial crisis is increasing at a lesser rate than the pre-crisis levels. Now, that's only a very small snapshot, but there's a number of possible reasons why that might be suggested. One is that the growth of investment in the global economy slowed, and investment goods are amongst the larger proportion of traded items. There's other suggestions that the economies that have grown quickly on the back of trade expansion are moving into a phase where their domestic growth is becoming more important. There's other suggestions that some of the trade augmenting benefits of former trade agreements, both multinational and regional and multilateral and plurilateral, are running out of steam. And you can think of the previous rounds of multilateral trade negotiations. You can think of China's accession to the WTO, and also the international technology agreements. But there's a variety of them, but the key point is that as they mature, the impact on growth of trade growth will also mature and become less dramatic. So that's just a little bit of background, and the idea is, well, what might be a further stimulus to growth of trade? Now, Yeah, in parallel, this is just another little stylized fact. The number of the incidence of bilateral and regional trade agreements has exploded, and the most, particularly since the year 2000, quite frequently that explosion of bilateral and regional agreements is associated with the failure to conclude Doha, and so that what happens is that bilateral and regional agreements become seen as an instrument of trade liberalisation. So that's just a little bit of background in the statistical sense, but I'd give you another little bit of background about the whole concept of trade liberalisation and how it might take place in a policy environment. Now, we can think of global action and think of the WTO, Doha Round type process, where it's all countries making a single agreement, and we can say that's fairly well stalled. We can also say that unilateral action, that is countries reforming their own trade regimes and their own economies, has received little emphasis. And when you're reading the newspaper, very rarely will you read, and this is in Australia, and I've just taken a glance at the British newspapers, and I think we're no exception, very rarely do you talk about measures that are reforming the domestic economy, in the domestic real economy. But what is, we do get some non-discriminatory agreements, they're plurilateral or regional, and some examples of that are the International Technology Agreement, also the APEC Bogor Declaration, and there's an Environmental Goods Agreement that is under negotiation. But they're examples of, each of those examples is a grouping of countries with a common aspiration, and the liberalisation is done on an MFN national treatment basis. But the other more common and endemic is preferential agreements. Typically, or often they're of a hub and spoke nature, perhaps the European Union signing agreements with other individual economies, the United States doing the same. And then there's also a range of cross-country or bilateral agreements between, say, Australia and New Zealand. You could think of the NAFTA as sort of a cross between a hub and spoke and a small bilateral. But they go on. But that is what's caused the sharp upturn in the graph is the increase in these preferential agreements. And as I said, the global action stalled. So what we're focusing on today is not the unilateral or the non-discriminatory agreements or the global action, but we're focusing on the preferential part of the reform and the noodle bowl of regulations that's generated. Now, preferential, as I mentioned, the preferential deals have clearly created this noodle bowl phenomenon. And some people say it's a spaghetti bowl, and some people say it's noodle bowl. And simply which region you come from will determine your choice of words. But what they do is they add to the regulation to enforce preferences. That's absolutely unambiguous. Those regulations add to compliance costs. That's actually unambiguous. They divert trade from the lowest cost to suppliers and erode productivity. Now, this becomes a little bit more subtle because we've got both direct, the first two items with direct effects. We also have indirect effects, and the productivity erosion we can see is an indirect effect. And I think when we think about it, the preferential deals really haven't suppressed the furtherance of multilateral liberalisation in themselves. Now, that can potentially result in negative overall impacts, and I'll give you an example in a moment. And I would suggest the proliferation of preferences is not supporting the building block case towards global trade liberalisation. But that's a matter of judgment. Some people might take a different view. But I just would like to go back to the eroding the productivity. To meet the rules of origin, you might have to change. You not only might have to change the sourcing of inputs, but you might have to have intermediate input substitution. So you've got your production technology might be a little bit different. You'd use one set of inputs rather than another. And I'll give you a simple example. in the Australian-New Zealand case, we've heard of an instance where people were adding a belt to a suit so it met the rules of origin. So the suit actually changed. It was no longer a suit, it was a suit plus a belt, and that got them over the rules of origin test. Now that was just a very small example, but I'm sure that there's the yarn forward rule, there's many other examples. Now that becomes a productivity eroding type phenomenon. And it's often referred to as intermediate input diversion. Now, thinking that these rules of origin and associated regulation are creating this noodle spaghetti bowl, and that is becoming of concern, and it is of concern in Australian policy circles, and I think more broadly as well. There's a number of strategies that you might follow. Now, the simplest strategies, there's a little clutch of simple strategies that might be followed within the context of the current agreements. Now, one, you might have harmonisation of simplification of rules within the existing agreements, and you can have dominance principles, you can have accession clauses to the agreements, might have more liberal rules themselves, and routine reviews and conference processes. So these are all things that could be cast within an agreement as it stands. And often those provisions are within agreement, that'd be fair to say. You can see a lot of those. Very rarely, I've never heard of a rule of origin liberalisation clause, but certainly the MFN clauses exist. And you could argue that there's accession clauses. There's quite a few examples of accession around. And the dominance rules, I think it'd be fair to say that some of the agreements are moving in that direction. But the simplest approach, the simplest way around all this, is perhaps not necessarily to negotiate more agreements or more refinements to agreements, but simply liberalise by removing the tariffs and the border restrictions that cause the regulations needing to be written. Now, in this talk, I'll be focusing on using quantitative analysis to focus on the relative economic value of each of these strategies. I'll also, towards the end, extend the analysis to non-tariff measures through the lens of services productivity. So it's not I won't be giving you a comprehensive analysis of non-tariff measures because they're enormously complex, and some of them are actionable and some of them are not. But I will be just using a simple simulation of service industry productivity to introduce that topic. Now, right. I'll just briefly, I'll be using a global general equilibrium modelling framework to do this. It'll be comparative static, so it compares the economy of the database of the model, which in this case is 2011, this is the latest database in the modelling framework we're using, to the economy in that year, but with a different set of regulations or different set of tariffs. So it's not a dynamic, it's not tracing the economy through time, it's just saying the economy with and without these tariffs. I'll be using the GTAP model, which some of you may be familiar with, and I'll be also using it, applying it in a way that was applied by the Productivity Commission in a 2010 report on bilateral and regional trade agreements. Now that report is cited in the full paper. Now that report used a 2004 database because it was the latest available at the time. My work uses a more recent database, but the actual modelling conventions are the same, and I've chosen to do that because the modelling conventions in that Productivity Commission report were heavily refereed at the time, and that report, in fact, was my responsibility. In the database, I've got 32 regions and 57 industries, which I'll expand on in a moment, and I adopt what's called a longer run perspective. And by the longer run perspective, I mean regional capital adjusts to equilibrate the rates of return at the national economy level. And for those who are familiar with GTAP will realise that's a little bit different to the standard version, which holds capital fixed and allows rates of return to vary. But the variant that I've applied, which required just the addition of an equation for the basic model, takes this longer run perspective. So capital varies and rates of return stay constant. The other two...
Can I just... we've had a long conversation about this. I'm watching Jenny looking quizzical. So let me do the best to very quickly explain. Suppose, simple case, you just impose on this model a productivity improvement. Some industries or all industry. Then the rate of return on capital in those industries will go up. What this, I think I'm right in saying, what this simulation method assumes is that capital is accumulated subject to diminishing returns with the fixed labour force and the fixed stock of land, accumulates enough to drive the rate of return after that shock back down to where it was before. Now, we had a long conversation about what's implicit in this, and there is implicit, correct me if I'm wrong, a savings, domestic savings function. So what I've just described sets out what happens in accumulation of capital through investment. Some of that will be financed by domestic savings, and the rest will be through the current account, and this model doesn't care less whether it's one or the other. So there's no either results or normative statement about the emerging current account deficit or surplus that it comes as a consequence of this. But this is, I completely agree with Paul, this is more interesting than holding the capital stock fixed in the face of, say, that productivity shock, which it clearly wouldn't be, because that would have created an opportunity to encourage capital accumulation.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, that's very good, yes.
Okay.
Once you accumulate capital by limit, actually you're creating an asset.
That's right.
Yeah, you're curating the asset, yeah. So this is a real economy model. So when we talk about capital, we're talking about real capital. And then, now I'll just go on and, to the last point, which reinforces David's. But the other assumptions is, or the other points is, that I've got, the model includes two categories of labour, a skilled and unskilled category. More or less the professions and office working type of people against process workers and agricultural workers. In the version that we're using now, the agricultural land and natural resources are fixed, so there's diminishing returns on that account. So there's diminishing returns both in labour and fixed labour supply by those two categories, and the natural resources. Now, the important point was that what we say about labour supply, the assumption that I've adopted is that it is not, it's given by external circumstances and not influenced by the trade policy. Now, we might return to a discussion on this. There are modes where you can change that assumption, but the assumption here is that the trade policy hasn't affected the stock of skilled workers in your economy. Now, the last point is capital accumulation is financed by domestic savings and net lending between the domestic economy and the rest of the world. And the model is indifferent between the mix, although the fact is that savings remains the dominant source of finance, but that the current account does vary.
And that remark about two different kinds of labour, you could imagine, and Jenny and I would like to try and imagine that Australian history is really like this, that when you displace unskilled labour by liberalising your, let's say, and allowing emerging market exports to come in, and Australian history, driving away the textile industry, you might carry out alongside that training for the workers to become skilled workers and move away from those sectors into more skilled sectors. And that's not what's going on here.
No, that's not. Yeah,
but you could do it.
You could do it. Yeah, you could envisage a transformation between the skilled and unskilled. Yeah, the unskilled to the skilled.
Yeah.
And I'll get I touch on that a little bit towards the end, but within the confines of these assumptions. Now,
does that mean that the relative wage is going to change?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And so there's two effects. There's the expansion effect, which pushes the economy-wide real wage up, and then there's a substitution effect, which causes the relative wages to change. But how much they change is really important, is depending Yeah. So, and I'll get to that in a very summary way at the end. Now, I just thought in the slides, and this is it can be seen from the paper, but I've just set out the slide, just a closer look at the aggregation in the model that I'm talking about, and it gives you a bit of a sense of the granularity that I've introduced on the country dimension. What I've tried to do in this model is to include nearly all RCEP members. So I miss out Brunei and Myanmar.
I have to tell everyone what RCEP is.
Regional
Cooperation. Economic policy?
Economic participation.
Oh, great.
Economic participation. So
it's Asia Pacific.
It's an Asia, as you can see from the left-hand side of the column, all the Asian economies, they're in this RCEP agreement. Now, you see some of them are in TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with the United States, and plus a couple of North American countries. And I haven't got in the model explicitly Peru and Chile, which are both TPP. I haven't. There's a practical constraint on this, and I limited myself to 32 economies for practical reasons. So there is a few that are missed out, which the alert person would have noticed. And I've also just flagged the TTIP. So you sort of, where you see this is the United States is a hub economy, and it has spokes in a number of it would have had spokes in a number of TPP economies, and if TTIP's completed, it will have spokes to the European economies. But yeah.
Can you easily explain the Hong Kong and rest of America lines, which are vacant?
Hong Kong is not in any of these agreements.
I'm intrigued.
Not even through China?
No, it's not a party to the agreement. I'm sure it's an observer, but it's not a party. Yeah. And also Taiwan.
Kept out by China.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it was rest of America.
Yeah.
So the rest of America is not involved in any of these either?
Yes, Chile and Peru are in TPP. But I just, it'd be nice to have those economies in, but I just limited myself to 32.
Okay.
I won't go into the technical details. Now, the other part that I have been complete on, and this exercise was actually done as an input into a G20 process. So I've actually got all the G20 economies, as you'll see. And there's the rest of Europe there's 19 countries, and the rest of the Europe makes the 20th. So that's and so it's, in a regional sense, the analysis has got quite a lot of granularity. Could have more, but this is quite a lot. And just to get a sense of the industries, now this is not a study on industry distribution, so I won't delve into this really in any detail at all. But you just might get a sense that I've used the full 57 industries available in the database, and there's quite a lot of granularity there. Reflecting the origin of the particular model, there's a lot of granularity in primary industries. There's some in mining, but their minerals NEC includes some important items like copper, aluminium, and lead and those products, but it picks up some of the key ones.
Where's iron? Is
Iron.
that in NEC as well?
Yes, yeah. Hard rock.
Okay.
Yeah. Manufacturing's is well represented by 24 industries. A critic would say the limitation of the classification, or where it could be benefited from being more disaggregated, is in separating parts from finished goods. But again, there's a lot of granularity here, but you could always imagine more granularity being interesting. You'll see in services it's represented by 15 industries, and that's actually quite detailed, and it gives you, there's the transport areas, you've got your finance areas, you've got your utilities and trade. So that's actually, in many ways, that services disaggregation is actually quite a good one. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the geography of the model and the database behind the results. Now, what I'll do now is turn to the results. So this is using the results to illustrate a policy point. So the purpose is to expand on the policy point, or these options, using quantitative analysis. And the key message we've got a key message from the first graph, but I'll just explain what's in the graph before we get to the message. In the graph, I have on the right-hand side global liberalisation. So that means all the economies in the world reduce their tariffs to zero on an MFN basis. Now this would be Doha plus, because even under Doha that wouldn't have come about. So this is you might say the ideal or the outer envelope potential, but it is a benchmark and a correct benchmark. Then I've got 4 other simulations, and I've got the TPP, and I call it PTA, and the RCEP PTA. Now what that is the removal of tariffs on a bilateral basis between the participating economies. So this is the traditional preferential agreement. And it's not the agreement that's negotiated, but it's probably not unrealistically wide of the mark. If you compared those TPP numbers with the work of the US Trade Commission, they're in the same ballpark. Now, but I've got 2 other simulations, and this is where I'm trying to bring out the policy implications, or the implications of different policies. I've got TPP open regionalism and RCEP open regionalism. Now what this is you can think of the Bogor Declaration under APEC, if you're familiar with it, is that this group of countries get together and say, we as a group will set our tariffs to zero on an MFN basis. So it's not preferential now, it's MFN. So they're trading with all countries in the world on an FMM basis, but they're doing it as a group. Okay, so this is an important difference. Now, some people might say this is unrealistic. Well, it's not unrealistic at all, because there are some important examples of where countries have got together as groups and liberalised on an MFN basis. The one is the Bogor, the Bogor arrangement. It hasn't got as far as was promised, but it has gone a significant distance. The other one is the International Technology Agreement. So the first one is an agreement between countries. The second one is what's called a critical mass agreement that was negotiated under WTO. But they're both MFN based. So there is examples, but not plentiful. And so we're leveraging the logic of this simulation off those examples and off the economic rationale for them as well. But what we see now, so I hope that's the simulations are clear. But what is the message from those simulations? That open regionalism, and I suppose this is obvious, dominates preferential agreements in a welfare enhancing sense, or on the path to global liberalisation. So what you see is TPP preferential rises to TPP open regionalism. RCEP preferential. Now it's a lot more communities, and the economies have got higher tariffs than the TPP group. They jump really substantially when you go open regional. Because of the country scope and the level of tariffs in the country, it's well on the way to global liberalisation. So that would be a major achievement in a policy and an economic sense. But what you can see...
Before you go on, is that 0.5, 1.0, 1.5?
Yes.
Of world GDP?
World GDP, yeah. Right. Oh, so yes, what we're talking about here is global GDP, yes.
But like all GTAP and CG simulations, these are small numbers. And we all want to believe that actually reality is much bigger than these. But these neoclassical microeconomic simulations always gives... It's no surprise that these are small numbers. This is the tradition.
This is the number. Now, we can talk about we can talk about the induced or dynamic, because that is well established in the theory. And in fact, there's even a paper by my own organisation that estimated the extra econometrically. But we'll get on. This is the effect of removing the tariff. So it's not any induced dynamic effects through trade and so forth. So I don't want to diminish that. Now, what you see is they're not terribly large in one sense, but this is global GDP. So, I don't know what the number is in my head, but 1% of global GDP is a large number, and it's not even across countries. So let's just have a look. Yeah.
80 trillion, so 1% of 80 trillion would be...
A billion? It's 8 billion, isn't it? Yeah. It's quite... But if when you see... I'll just get on to the next one about where it
Is 800 billion.
yeah.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. But just where the money is, where the money goes. And this... what I've done here is I've ranked the countries in my 32 economies by the impact of global liberalisation on GDP. So it goes from left, which is Singapore, and there's a little bit of story about Singapore, which I'll just inform you of, down to the US. Now, if what that ranking is comes about, the two factors that determine that ranking most, the dominant factors, are the level of protection, tariff protection in the economy prevailing at the current levels, and trade exposure. So those two factors describe that profile. There's other factors, distance and so forth, but those two factors describe most of the variation. So what you see is the United States at one end. Why is it there? Very simply, it's not terribly trade exposed. It's got quite a low, the share of its exports plus imports to its GDP is quite low compared to all the other economies, including the European. The other end is Singapore, which is highly trade exposed. I'll just mention the reason for the Singapore result, because it is an anomaly. In the database, there's a very, very high tariff on imports of petrochemicals into Egypt. And petrochemicals is the major manufacturing exporter of the Singapore economy. And that particular anomaly, which we've actually queried the GTAP consortium over, is driving that result, that large post. So just I mentioned that as a point of clarification, if you want to push that question. But the others aren't influenced by that little anomaly, and so what you find is Thailand, Vietnam, Korea have got a relatively trade exposed, and have got relatively high levels of relatively high levels of domestic protection, and that scales down to the United States at the other end. You see Australia in about the middle there. Towards the end, about 2/3 the way down on the right. That's so obviously when I was presenting this in Australia, that was the bar that most people's eyes lit upon. But that's the gradation, and that's the rationale for the total gradation. But now within that gradation, you see TPP preferential, so the countries that are party to the TPP, like Vietnam, the first part of the bar is the preferential part. So what happens there is it's a country with relatively high export tariffs that gains access to the other TPP member economies on a preferential basis. So that as an economy would benefit materially from TPP. But you see, the Mexican results don't so benefit, because Mexico and Canada and Australia have got access to the North American market already through a preferential arrangement. So the TPP wouldn't do much work on the trade front. But what you see for Vietnam and for all the TPP economies, you see a black bar. So if TPP was on an MFN or open regional basis, each of the TPP participants would gain additionally, and would actually cover most of the difference, gain close to what would be available from global liberalisation. So you've got, again, a very staged process. The stage is from preferential, will benefit the members that aren't already in an agreement with the hub economy, and you've got the scope for further improvement through MFNing the preferences. And for many countries, that takes you well towards the global case.
And for comparison purposes, what would happen with the retrograde removal of NAFTA to Mexico and Canada there?
The removal of NAFTA would cause an expansion.
Of Mexico.
Well, that's an interesting thing. If you just see, you've got a little negative for Mexico with global liberalisation. That's the Mexico then would face, in this case, more competition with global liberalisation into the North American markets. So that's a little negative. But you can still see
I'm
open...
just trying to work out in my head how far under the line it might be.
Oh, well, there it is there. Oh, no, that's not... It would be not... See the little negative?
Yeah.
It would be a portion of that.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can still see the open regionalism for the TPP economies, that's the black bar, would still do...
Yeah.
Because what's the reason for that? Mexico's still got quite high external tariffs. And that's just that I won't dwell, but the RCEP is the same picture except for more economies. So you can see the grey bar at the bottom gives an uplift for the participants, and then the black bar, so you can pick the participants easily by the black bar. So the Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, and Malaysia would all do quite well out of an RCEP developed on an open regional basis. But they'll also do, because of the sheer economic scope of RCEP, they'd benefit from an agreement even on a preferential basis. You'll see India and China in there. China, when you get economies as big as China, you've got the diminishing return point, so they don't benefit quite as much. But look, I'll move on now to rules of origin. Now, the results that I presented so far did have a discount for rules of origin. And I'll just mention just briefly what the discount is, and I'll also mention some research on the rules of origin. My first exposure to rules of origin was in 2004 with the CER, the Closer Economic Relations Agreement between Australia and New Zealand. And the rules of origin, I was responsible for a study into the rules of origin in that agreement. And I suppose that experience was illuminating to notice, and the discussion around it convinced me that the rules of origin were both a regulation and a regulation that wasn't productive. And we made some very firm recommendations in the report towards trying to move away from the rules of origin type framework. Needless to say, because there was momentum building up around preferential agreements at the time, those recommendations didn't get much traction. But there is a growing body of literature now, and it's actually becoming quite significant and quite diverse, about the costs of rules of origin and their take-up. Now, one field of literature talks about the take-up of preferences, and what you see from that field of literature is the significant variation between agreements of take-up. So some of the agreements, the take-up might be down around 20, 30, perhaps nudging up towards 40%. Some agreements might be over 90%. So there's a high level of variation between agreements. Now, the second point is that trade creation between partners can be outweighed by trade diversion. So remember, the rules of origin enforce the preference and enforce the trade diversion. Now, we've done some, and I was personally involved in it, econometrics for the CER, and one of the most robust results of that econometric exercise was that CER had a negative impact on trade between Australia's trade and New Zealand's trade, total trade. A colleague in Australia has done a similar exercise for OSFDA and drawn the same conclusion.
But for what? What's that second group?
OSFDA, Australia-US Free Trade Agreement.
Oh, that's actually negative.
And that came up negative too. But I put a greater weight on the CER result because the OSFDA result came into force just before the GFC, so that there's a confounding effect. But it wasn't. He did get negative. That's the important bit. But the CER, this was before the GFC, and the agreement itself started in 1984. So it had a very long history that could be included in the data. What's the reason for this? Well, we've got two small economies, being Australia and New Zealand, at the edge of a fast-growing region, and we sign an agreement between ourselves to divert trade between two relatively mature economies. And that trade was diverted away from a fast-growing region. And that's what these econometrics picks up, and that it is quite clearly negative. And that was, we tested it with different model specifications over different sub-periods. a variety of sensitivity tests, and it was always negative. So I'm prepared to believe it, and I think there's a logic behind the negativity. That's written up with the 2010 report that I referred to. And so, but the other one is the economic cost. There's other studies out there that are suggesting the economic costs of roux go up to 25% of the production value of the product value. So where tariffs are relatively low, it would preclude taking up the preference for a rational person. There's other cases where roux on final products, say final garments, final cars, can reduce the intermediate good input from non-members, and taking NAFTA as a case, so you've diverted trade of intermediates into the NAFTA zone. And the study that is cited in the report says 30%, but the actual magnitude is not important. What's important is the fact that it happens. And then there is suggestions in some literature that the rules of origin fall heaviest on small and medium-sized enterprises that have got less legal capacity, less accounting practice capacity to actually do all the calculations. And you could extend that to, say, lesser developed economies. So that's the body of literature, which, as I said, is substantial and growing. There's no single estimate of the cost of roux. So in my analysis, I've just taken 25% as a number, as a discount. So I've applied that 25%.
Just before you go on, could I ask you to clarify one thing?
Yes.
I teach all this sort of stuff to my undergraduates studying international economics, with almost no mention of rules of origin, but still also discuss trade diversion, in that you can get trade diversion quite independently of rules of origin, simply because within a free trade area or customs union, you cut tariffs on those others in the union that are participating with you. That causes you to buy imports that you would have bought from China, from Germany instead, and that trade diversion may end up being costly to you, because you end up as an economy paying more for the inputs from Germany than you would have paid for from China, even though you think you're doing trade liberalization.
Yes.
And that's a standard result. And so my question is, do we know how much of the trade diversion is happening for price reasons and how much for these rules of origin reasons?
Well,
is that a clear question?
It's a very clear question, and it's actually, I won't answer the question fully, but I'll answer it in a stylized manner.
Sure.
Because I've got my 25%. So I've just said, but you could argue it's 30% or something.
Sure.
So and I call this the roux pincer, right? Now, on this graph, I'll explain the graph. So again, I've got the top of the graph is the global liberalisation, and I'm taking TPP and RCEP as my agreements, and I've got the black bar as the open regionalism, but now I've got the bottom bar is the grey region with restrictive rules of origin. Yeah. So this is where it's having an additional cost to the simple preference. And so, with for all the reasons we've given, and then I've removed the 25%. Now I've just removed this by just simple multiplication.
Sure.
I didn't rerun all the simulations, but the same answer. So what you get is you get a little uplift of 25%. So the grey bit and the hatch and the brick bit, the building block, will bring you up to the case which you teach in the course. So this is preferential, the preferences without any overheads, regulatory overheads. So this is what I mean by the pincer.
And as shown, when you're thinking just about tariff preferences, as shown, trade creation dominates trade diversion. That's why where you get up to isn't a negative number.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, our econometrics, though, for the CER, because this is in general equilibrium, the econometrics in the CER suggest that there's a dynamic process which actually can cause creation to be less than diversion.
Just for price reasons?
No, for the dynamic, the indirect effects. Yes. Yeah, the indirect effects. I think that's the case. I can talk about
I didn't want to interrupt. I was just trying to get this clear.
But there is the CER result that we get in the econometrics. I'm convinced is a dynamic point, not a static point. So this is all static. So, but why I call it a pincer is people say, oh, well, liberalise the rules of origin, we'll get significant benefits. Now, the odd thing about that is if you are going to get significant benefits, the original agreement is worth very little, because significant benefits is coming towards the outer envelope that's taught in the trade courses. So it's you've lost both ways in a sense. If you are going to get significant benefits, the original agreement's worth very little to you. If you are going to get significant benefits, it takes you up to the black bar, but it doesn't take you into the open regionalism case.
Sure.
So I think that's a really important, I mean, a lot of these policies to liberalise rules of origin are well-intentioned and well thought out, but the proposition that they might give significant economic benefits is can't be strongly made.
So can I just...
Yes, by all means,
try and help everybody understand.
Yes.
If you liberalise world trade, you go up there, forget that. If you did open regionalism in this, is this our set?
Yeah. Yes.
If you did open regionalism in our set, you get that, forget that. If you did our set without open regionalism, just straightforward our set, and no rules of origin, you go all the way up there.
Yeah.
And rules of origin are taking away that much of what you got. Now it's semantic about what's a lot and what's a little, but that's the extra that you could get. Although it's not wonderful, it doesn't go all the way there. You could get up to there if you got rid of the rules of origin, but doing preferential damage by rules of origin pulls you down to there. Is that just what you're saying?
Yes.
Thanks.
And
Sorry, can I clarify? Because I'm always a bit vague about rules of origin, but the way I think about them is that they are the mechanism that actually enforces the strict version of your preferential agreement. I mean, they say this agreement only applies to a product that is made in this country, or that is 80% made in this country. And what is actually the case for most products is they're made 50% here and 50% over there. So in effect, if you take out the rules of origin and don't say anything about that, it opens a back door for trade to take place from the most efficient supplier, because in effect
through you, and you do 1% of,
that's right.
and,
So,
and you just a
50%
shipment agency, and you're cheating on the FTA.
Made in China, but 1% made in New Zealand, and it comes in under the agreement. So that what you're really showing there is how much you would get by kind of avoiding some of the worst trade diversion effects by letting the products that actually come from the cheapest
and
supplier.
it's absolutely correct.
That's a generous way of interpreting rules of origin. That they prevent sneaking in under what's really not goods made within the region, but just sneaking in. Let me give you the opposite, ungenerous interpretation. That a bunch of the Australian-American agreement, a bunch of lawyers in Washington looked at car manufacturing in Australia and understood for each kind of car that 37% of this was imported. That's to say 63% of it was made in Australia. So the rules of origin on that kind of car were set at 64. And that meant that no cars of that kind could be exported to America. And then the lawyers went to the next car and discovered how much of that came from abroad and set the rules of origin one above that. And the end result was that Australia exported exactly 0 extra cars to America after having done all this wonderful negotiation. Now, what Jenny says, obviously the other end of the spectrum, and this is this end of the spectrum, and what clearly that is just straight cheating, but this is legal nonsense. And you're trying to find somewhere in the middle, and getting somewhere in the middle is very difficult.
It's extreme. And the thing, I mean, the yarn forward rule, for those who are familiar with it, is the David described the manipulation of the ratios to get a result, and that does go on. The rules of origin are negotiated line by line, and they're negotiated with protection in mind. The yarn forward rule requires it is a yarn-forward rule. So
What does yarn mean?
The yarn, as in spinning.
You're right.
The yarn-forward rule means that the yarn itself's got to be spun in the economy that makes the final product.
Oh, right. So that's
So that's what it's called,
example.
yarn forward.
Yeah.
Has to be made
Yeah,
here.
yeah, and that is that is notoriously one of the most egregious rules of origin.
Sorry, could you go over that again? The yarn?
It has to be spun in the country that
makes the shirts.
Makes the shirts, or in the region.
Everything in the product, from yarn
Yeah.
forward to the
Yeah,
final
yeah.
product.
What's the expression spinning a yarn?
Spinning. Yeah, but look, I think the thing is, it's a. When you first come to rules of origin, it's explained. Oh, you need rules of origin
For Jenny's reason.
for good reasons, to make sure that the members of an agreement legitimately get preferences. However, rules of origin they're negotiated line by line. This is a fact, and they do vary with the protectionist sentiment. And now that is as David said, that is the harsher interpretation. But it takes us to a recommendation that the Commission's made on 2 occasions, and that is when the tariffs are low, to waive the rule. In other words, you deem, if it comes from the port of your partner, it's deemed to be made there. Now, that would take you, in David's language, up towards the case. The recommendation when we made it was to take you towards that limiting case. But that recommendation has been not taken up on 2 occasions. That's just a documented point. So anyway, we can move on, but I think it's a really important discussion to understand where the rules of origin fit in and how they take you away to the outer envelope potential of what might be available in a preferential agreement. And the further they take you away from the potential, the reality is that the less the original agreement is worth. Now, so I won't give the individual country results for the rules of origin case because they're in the paper, but I'd like now to move on to another scenario that's suggested as a possible way of liberalising trade within a preferential framework, and that is through accession. And so what I've done in this case is I've said a hypothetical accession economy, South Africa, joins, and that's a G20 economy, so that's the reason I chose it, joins RCEP. And that's not a silly thing because it's got one coastline facing the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and we've got India in RCEP. So in a sense, it's got a regional dimension to it. Now, what happens there is you'll see the building blocks. I've always taken the policy as represented on these graphs as a building block. So it gives a building block gain to the accession economy, but you can't really see the building block on any of the other countries. So the accession would have negligible impact on the other economies.
Small open economy going in.
Small open economy with high external tariffs. Now that comes, you'll see a black bar is negative. That is what's foregone. You don't get, this is at the expense of open regionalism, so that becomes negative in this case, just the way the arithmetic's done. So, and then then there's the total impact for South Africa is that the negative, the hatch, and the speckled bar.
From below to above.
Yeah, that's the total. And then you see the RCEP negotiating parties to the left of South Africa and other regions to the right. But I think it's fair to observe that if a small to medium-sized open economy with relatively high tariffs can gain access to a large preferential agreement, there is a benefit to that economy, and that'll be a fair observation.
Can I say something about that? Because I published a theoretical paper on this, done with one of my former graduate students. It's the only paper I've ever published in the Journal of International Economics, and it studies an imaginary RCEP, and it says, should RCEP let a new country like South Africa into the framework. And yes. Well, should it imaginarily go all the way to global free trade? And the answer is no way, because you need to be able to kick the head in of somebody. That's the purpose of having a diversionary trade agreement. You can't divert trade from nobody. So we computed the optimal size beyond which you would keep everybody else out because you wanted to rip them off by forcing them to have worse terms of trade as a result of your agreement. There's a very famous paper by Yi which did this with a rather in this framework, and we extended that in our paper to a framework with monopolistic competition. But it gives you the reason I say this. Of course, that's the thing that a generous social planner living in the sky, that person would want to do what Paul describes. But there is the political economy point that keeping other people out in order to be able to benefit from the fact that you've done so might end up being part of the discussion.
There is special cases even within this model where you can generate
Can do that.
exactly that result. And
And the optimum size is?
Well, this is all algebra, so
This is
it didn't tell us anything about reality. It's a very interesting question. You could ask that with this model. Just try.
I'm just looking for some.
Stick it to run over and over again.
I'm just looking for some little negatives. There's a little negative in Taiwan, but that's outside the group. But you could generate, using David's logic, a little negative inside.
Well, RCEP's not big enough.
Yeah.
So I said more and more, wonderful, but you wouldn't go all the way there. Well, I think RCEP's small enough for you to still be in the region where one more would be a good idea.
Yeah.
So I think that's why how I can understand what Paul's just said.
But anyway, I think this is like.
But if you added TTIP as well, you might well have got to
some kind of
something like that.
Yeah, but you never actually get the black bar.
No, my view is if this framework had become big enough, the next country added would begin to do black bars for the existing members.
Yeah. That's a fair comment. If it was big enough, anyway, so that's. But now, what I'd like to do is look at the case of unilateral reform, because you remember that box we presented at the very beginning, where you had unilateral action, multilateral action, preferential action, and the concerted MFN action in the bottom left-hand corner. But what I've done here for each G20 economy, and only for that, just because of the computational load and the context of the paper, I did a unilateral liberalisation. In other words, the country removes its tariffs, and no other country acts. So Australia, for example, my country, could simply wake up tomorrow and remove its tariffs, as could Korea or any other country on the graph. And so this plots that decision one by one. And then I've also plotted the case of global action. So the question is, how far does the action of an economy acting individually take it towards the global case? Now, for my country, which is being Australia, it happens to be 80%. For other countries, it, as you can see, varies, and that all depends on their trade exposure, who they're trading with, and the level of tariffs, current tariff protection. But it's significant. So you, for most countries, you can say it covers most. And I think that's a general statement. However, there is a group of countries to the right, and that where the story is a little bit more subtle.
Can you just tell us about Mexico and Saudi Arabia at the minute?
Mexico is the building blocks is the unilateral liberalisation. So it's got relatively high tariffs, compared to other countries.
And so that it has originally an optimal tariff, and when you remove it, you get worse off. Is that what's happening?
So your building block, you must remember this is NAFTA's still in place. So I've liberalised and my external tariff, and I've got preferential access to the North Atlantic Treaty, NAFTA, sorry.
Why does that make you worse off?
Well, because when I do global liberalisation now...
No, I'm asking why there's a bit below the line. What is it that pulls you below the line?
See the star,
yeah, that's global.
That's global. Well, if we have global liberalisation, you are now getting other countries, which is global liberalisation is everybody liberalising.
Yeah.
So Mexico would face more competition in the North American market because global liberalisation, NAFTA no longer has force. So it's getting a benefit in its own building block case. It's getting a benefit from cheaper imports from all sources, and it's still got preferential access to the North American market. Global liberalisation, tariffs in the North American market removed, and so now Mexico's competing with all economies. And so it's facing increased competition globally.
So it's removal of the trade creation caused by NAFTA.
Yeah.
And that's why there's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is that?
Yeah, that's. I interrupted you. Thank you. That explains something.
I think it's it's worthwhile sort of touching on these as we go along, because, but each one can be explained in its own way. Now we'll move on. But what I would like to do, because we're in the northern hemisphere and not the southern hemisphere, my Australian colleagues were obviously more interested in the Asian areas, but there is some important subtleties in the EU case, and I'd just like to say how I modelled the EU in this case. The modelling of the EU in this case was the EU economies, the 28, acted together to remove tariffs, remove their external tariff. In the US case, it acted individually to remove its external tariff. So what you find is that building block case gave a benefit, but the most benefit given European tariffs are relatively low globally, most benefits would derive from other countries around the globe lowering their tariff, and so it's increased export opportunities.
It's also because
Expansion. Yeah.
No,
Sorry?
not true. Quite.
Right? Is that,
But then another. There's an important additional simulation to be done for this, which is what we've been talking about, namely that the European Union continues to exist with its single market, and Britain unilaterally quits and unilaterally liberalises.
Yeah.
But then you have to do all the question of what kind of hard Brexit or whatever. I'll stop interrupting.
But
that's a very particular kind of Europe simulation.
It's a particular, and it's a status quo.
Yeah.
And very deliberately, but it quickly, as soon as you see the graph, your imagination quickly takes you to other possible scenarios. I appreciate that. But I just jotted down the trade exposure. But I'd like to say one little point, which arises from some analysis that I've seen, is that, there's a lot of intermediate good trade within Europe, global value chains. Say the rest of the EU and Germany, United Kingdom, or each of them, there's a big intermediate good trade between the countries, and then there's the export of final goods, and then there's the import of intermediate goods. And so how it affects the individual economies will depend on where they are in the global value chains. And that would be important, say, for the UK, how much of its intermediate goods come from the continent compared to other places, and how important the export of finished goods are, both to the continent and other places. But anyway, I'd just like to mention that as just a little, how your mind could expect, think of other interpretations of this. Now, very quickly, I'd just like to touch on, this goes back to Jenny's earlier comment, labour market and consumer implications. Now, in this, we can say reasonably that the noodle bowl, spaghetti bowl of regulations and preferences reduce income from the outer envelope potential. So you might argue that you can increase it from where you are, but that is not taking you to the outer envelope potential. Now, but real wages for skilled and unskilled groups, as we've modelled them, could rise broadly in line with each other, and that's shown in the detailed results presented. But that requires a flexible labour market where these people can move between industries on the basis of the relative competitiveness of industries. A very important assumption, and that it doesn't, as we touched on earlier, depends on the assumption of variable capital stock, that the incentive and the mechanisms are available for countries to expand their capital stock in response to the improved competitiveness. Now, in a dynamic sense, and this is sort of adding to the interpretation, the liberalisation, gains from liberalisation is leveraged to labour market arrangements which facilitate the movement, like retraining, social measures. Now, they might be peculiar to a country. That's obviously way beyond this paper, but the gains are leveraged to that kind of flexible arrangements that encourage the flexibility. And another thing we can say is narrower liberalisation, even if it's successful in its own right, narrows the scope for benefits and could penalise others. So obviously, if a country liberalises, it benefits more so itself, so relatively speaking, you're narrowing the benefit. If you liberalise in certain activities, you're confining the benefit to those activities. Obviously a case of broad-based liberalisation spreads the benefits most widely. Household consumption.
Another way of putting that, what you just said, is to describe me as looking at this in search of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which is a theorem in a very specialised, simple Hector-Olin trade model. Liberalisation benefits the factor used intensively in the production of the import whose trade is liberalised, and damages the other factor. Now, you just said broad-based liberalisation makes everybody better off, and that's an anti-Stolper. So the Stolper-Samuelson theorem is not true in that case for reasons which you could probably reasonably simply work out about how all the benefits are spread everywhere. But if you liberalised just a few industries, for example, just industries, went through your computer program and liberalised for industries which used unskilled labour intensively, then you'd end up, as a result of this liberalisation, making everyone else better off in the economy except unskilled labour, which would end up worse off. Possibly. Depends what the capital accumulation story does. But you can see why I'm kind of in search of Stolper-Samuelson type ideas, and you can also see why they're generally not in play in what you've said.
And actually, I can just expand on that a bit about what. In our national competition policy in Australia, one of the arguments put in favour of a broad-based reform is that it benefited each part of the reform benefited different groups, and particularly manufacturing against services. But anyway, look, we could have a very good discussion about that. But what I'd like to do is just to take you into the area of non-tariff measures, and in a very simple way, because I know that non-tariff measures are enormously complicated. Some non-tariff measures are actionable and some are non-actionable, and the judgment about what is actionable and what is not actionable itself might be contentious. But what I would like to demonstrate, just in terms of productivity of services, because a lot of non-tariff measures apply to services, not all, is the case of a simple services productivity improvement, a 1% improvement in the productivity of value added of service industries, all the services industries in the economy, except dwellings. And what I've done is a series of simulations, one for each country, and then I've done a second simulation of all countries had act together.
Yeah.
And the all countries act together case is the star, and the case of countries acting individually is the grey bar. And what you see there is really most of the benefit comes from the own action. Now, there's a sense to this because service industries are often non-traded, and often it's difficult to distinguish between the service that's exported and imported, in the local market. So that is sort of the underlying reason for that result. But it is this, I think, some fairly important policy messages that come from this, which I'll just move to. Matters that can be addressed domestically should be not delayed and benefits foregone to attain negotiating or bargaining coin in a preferential agreement. And I think that's an interpretation, but I think it's a reasonable interpretation. Even if it gets down to liberalising your ports, which is clearly a trade-related activity. Where matters require cooperation, then adopt non-discriminatory procedures and avoid rules of origin in services and investment transactions. Now, these are not often spoken about, but in agreements there's typically denial of benefits clauses. And denial of benefits clauses are centred around the ownership of the parties. And for practical purposes, they act like rules of origin. But they're not termed rules of origin in the documents that are before us. And I would suggest, and this is an interpretation that this is my interpretation, the priority should be given to policies that afford the greatest economic benefits. So if you think about it, there'd be no point or little point in agreeing to policies that have small benefits and carving out an area of policy that could have a large benefit. From an economic perspective, it would be better to tackle the more difficult issue. But that's a point of interpretation rather than an analysis. Now, I thank you for your attention. I'll just come to the conclusion. I've got two conclusions. One on the analysis and then the second one on some of the quantitative work. I think my feeling is from the analysis that quantitative work can be used to demonstrate the case for trade reform and addressing the noodle bowl in preferential agreements. I think it can be suggested that transition strategies seeking piecemeal improvement through preferential frameworks are most likely to be slow and most likely to be productivity sapping. Strategies based on concerted unilateral or open regional action have got much more to offer, but I think we appreciate also can be difficult to apply in a broader political framework. I think that the quantitative complemented by qualitative evaluation can make the case for change and identify adjustment pressures. We've got onto a few of those in our discussion, but what I would be suggesting very strongly is that when an analysis is undertaken, you analyse the full reform potential and you don't limit your analysis to what might be gained available from a particular policy or narrow options, because you juxtapose what you're trying to achieve against what might be possible, the outer envelope. Finally, I would suggest transparency is important, and that's a topic that's often discussed, but I think more important is a comprehensive economy-wide view. In other words, economy-wide, what is the impact of the policy on the whole economy? And I'll just give you an example here. Intellectual property, which we haven't even touched on today. Often you might see intellectual property evaluated from a point of view of income flows from the conference of a monopoly through intellectual property regulation. And it might be said that the more transfers, the more benefits there are from intellectual property regulation. You could put that crudely. But the real question with intellectual property is how much additional research and development and new ideas will those generate, and what will the community-wide benefits will be? And that is a slightly different question to how it will impact on the owners of intellectual property. So that makes, I think, helps make the case for an economy-wide view is critical. Now, I'd just like to make a few passing comments about the modelling framework. The GTAP model and database are readily available and documented. Anybody in this room could go to the GTAP webpage and buy the database and download the model, and they could go to the Centre of Policy Studies webpage at the Victoria University in Australia and buy the software needed to run the model, relatively cheaply. The only pain is actually learning to do the job. Yeah, but not an inconsiderable pain. But it is accessible at a public level. It's not proprietary. Now, the model that I've used here is comparative static real economy and makes the capital adjustments assumptions that we've said. I've made an add-on to enable me to do that in the context of this paper. But there is a dynamic variant of GTAP available called GDIN, and I've been looking at that, and my feeling is that the model as it's described in a book, readily available book, it represents standard neoclassical growth theory assumptions, but I feel it has partial adjustment of capital to show a transition path to full adjustment, which is what a comparative static model doesn't do. But in my analysis so far, and I've been having consultations about this, is that the current dynamic GTAP has stability issues which require attention before it might be generally available. Now, this is something that's being investigated, and where I would suggest at this stage there's not a firm conclusion, but I think pursuing it, resolution of these questions that are in my mind, takes us into a new area of policy interest, and it takes you into the area of the time scale of adjustment and distribution effects over time. And if you think of public policy, they are important public policy questions, not just the long-run comparative static effect, but how you get there. And I sort of feel that's an area that requires and deserves attention, intellectual attention, and I just mention that not so much to debate the model itself, because I think this is not the topic of today, but I mention this as something to look to in the future. And on that, I'll thank you very much for the discussion as we've gone along, and your attention during the presentation.
Thanks very much.